Hello, everybody. Hello, my dear friends. Hello, my dear friends. That's recorded now for posterity. When the fossils will be found in 1,000 years from now, they'll say, "What was that voice?" They'll say, and they're going to try to trace you down. Okay, there you go. Today, everything is forever, which is a good idea. That every word is forever. That's interesting, for good and for bad. So, welcome everybody in the cyberspace, and right here, my good friends from eons ago. You haven't aged a drop, by the way, since I saw you 20 years ago. Seriously. And it's not my eyesight. My eyesight is very 20/20. So we talked tonight about, are you lost in the wilderness? And the class is dedicated in memory, in loving memory of Aryeh Tzvi ben Zev HaKohen, whose yahrzeit is the 22nd of Iyar. So we share some words of Torah, and hopefully that inspires and motivates people to improve and enhance and grow in their lives. So the soul of Aryeh Tzvi ben Zev HaKohen partakes in this journey, and it's an honor both for him and for his daughter Debbie, who dedicated this, that it should only be good news and simchas in people's lives, and the power of the souls that have passed on should continue to empower us here on earth, because the fact is that there's only a small veil and curtain between the souls there and us down here, which is, I think, one of the last things I've told you when I saw you back then. My father's yahrzeit happened to be yesterday, the 20th of Iyar. So I say it also on a personal note, that despite the fact that we are pretty myopic, our vision, we see what's on this side of the curtain, the fact is reality is far bigger than this image we have, and the souls see us. So it's only we are unable to see on that side of the curtain, but they can see us, and they participate in our lives in their own way. Obviously it's still painful, because we'd like to everyone be on the same side of the curtain, but if you need an example for this, I always talk about this as in context of, let's say, taking quantum mechanics. The fact of the matter is nobody sees subatomic particles, and yet we know they're brimming everywhere, and the dynamic energy makes things come alive, makes things be alive. So though we don't see the energy is there. And so energy is one of those examples. And every time you get on your cell phone, or you text someone, or you watch something on TV or internet, or any other context, you're having a living example of spirit and energy that is invisible to the eye, but its impact but it has a constant impact on our lives. So I always use the example, and it just comes to me, it's somewhat of a little humorous anecdote. When people ask, where does the soul go to upon passing, upon death? So the answer is based on that. The whole question is based on a arrogant premise, and that is, we think we know where it's at, so we wonder, where does the soul go to? So let's use this analogy. Imagine an imaginary dialogue, conversation between a refrigerator and electricity. And the refrigerator asks the electricity, where do you go when they pull the plug? So electricity answers incredulously to the refrigerator, what kind of chutzpah, what kind of nerve is that type of question? What do you mean, where I go to? I was always around. You're a little box that they just invented the last 200 years. And now you think you're the center of the universe. You're a little box that people figured out how to contain energy in this box called the refrigerator. And now you think that you're the center of it all. I go back where I always was, uncontained by little boxes like you. This is a perfect example. We ask the question where a soul goes to based on a premise that we think this is where it's at, our perspective. But that would be like someone, like an ant, or someone standing at the ground asking, where's the horizon? If you haven't climbed the mountain, you don't see the big picture. You can deceive yourself into thinking reality is only that which you see and hear and taste and touch and smell. So it's a perfect example, and that's electricity. Electricity goes back to wherever it is, beyond time and space or in time and space, but it's not quite visible and definitely not contained. So as such, it's just a good, interesting way to look at, understand how little we know about life. Even that which we do know, which is the body. Forget about the soul. Even the human body, which is a 5-6 foot tall physical body that weighs 100 pounds, 150 pounds. I'm not going to go higher than that. And what do we know about this body? We know much, but there's so many mysteries. What do we know about the human brain? which is the size of the palm of a hand, a little larger. Mysteries. So to start making claims that we understand what, just based on our perspective, we get the picture, we don't get the picture. That doesn't mean we don't have much knowledge, but if you don't have the humility, the more you know, the more you realize how much more there is to know. So that's a segue into the discussion that we're going to have here about, are you lost in the wilderness? And we'll talk about it in a very practical way. I get letters and emails all the time. I meet people. So I quoted today a letter which I sent out in the email about this class. So if you haven't seen it, I'll paraphrase. I once was paid for my memory. Not really paid much, but I paid a little on Shabbos and holidays when the Lubavitcher Rebbe would speak, so I had to memorize these out. So we received a letter that captures it all. A person says, when I was younger, I was optimistic, idealistic, believed in the future, had hope, believed in love and relationships and growth, had faith in others and so on. And then things changed. The first time I was lied to, he writes, it was an anomaly. So I dismissed it. I forgave it. But then I came to realize as a growing into an adult that this world is a very hostile world. Backstabbers, liars, duplicity, deception, and so on. And I've developed a very jaded view of hopelessness, lack of faith, lack of trust, and so on. So my question was, how many of us feel this way? We begin our lives younger, more idealistic, and we dream aspirations, and then things are broken. There's betrayals, broken promises, dashed dreams, etc., etc. And to the point where you really look around, you start wondering, what kind of world do we live in? You see people that for a few dollars, suddenly friends become enemies. You see people that are otherwise kind and compassionate people, if it comes something that is selfish or greedy or so on, they suddenly can stab someone in the back that they knew very long. And you start wondering, is this world a jungle, a wilderness, a hostile wilderness, or is it a garden? Now, this doesn't dismiss the fact that there are many positive experiences in life, but in the sum total of it, what does it look like? So I'm not asking you to answer right now. Answer to yourself. And it's a topic that should be addressed and must be addressed, because the world definitely looks often that type of hostile. Now, it's true. We live in a far more humane world in many ways today, humanitarian world, than several centuries back. Take, for example, a number of years ago, 2-3 years ago, the earthquake in Haiti. So if you know your history, there was an earthquake in a country, especially a poor country. What happened? All the neighboring countries, they basically pillaged, raped, and completely exploited that country and its people. Here you had countries competing on bringing humanitarian aid to the poor Haitians. So the question is why? Why would American taxpayers tolerate that? Why should our money, hard-earned money, be going to a country that doesn't have any benefit to us? And you see this trend has changed. As I said, when Greece suffered, the old ancient Greece suffered a great earthquake, we all know what happened. That was the end of their empire, the end of their dynasty. So history was very cruel when these things happen. And today you see a lot more humanitarianism and aid and foreign aid and charity. The concept of charity has taken hold. America gets a lot of credit for that. It's the most charitable country. This doesn't mean there aren't problems and faults in this country. But charity, the amount of charity that individual citizens give and the country as a whole gives. You may not agree where those charities go, the money goes, but the fact that so much money is being spent is pretty unprecedented. Why should a country, everyone should think, let it come back to us. Well, just take care of us. Why are we giving it out there? So cynics will say, because ultimately it comes back because we're developing new markets for IBM and McDonald's and Coca-Cola, etc. Maybe. That may be some part of the incentive, but it didn't begin that way. When America became a charitable country, it was not because it was building marketplaces. That maybe was a incidental benefit that came in time. The point I want to make is that there are many beautiful, noble examples of virtue and kindness. I'm not suggesting that you only see hostility. But when you look closer, you look at, let's say, in corporate America, you look at the boardrooms, you look especially the financial the sector. You talk to people who work there, many will tell you that they lost their souls. Because you basically have to cut out your conscience. It's a very dog-eats-dog environment, a lot of competition. You don't really have loyal friends. Everybody's busy outmaneuvering someone else because that's what the bosses want. They want people to compete with each other. And they create actually environments that are meant to be peaceful. They don't want that. They play people against each other. So when you see these things, it creates a very sad and despondent attitude. So I want to address this because obviously it's not an issue that just began today. It goes back to the beginning of history, beginning of time. And it's a question that goes back all the way back to the Bible in times of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, as we shall soon discuss. And of course, the Torah itself talks about 75%, 80% of the Torah takes place in the wilderness. I don't know if you ever noticed that. If you read the Torah, so it has 5 books, right, of Chumash. So book number 1 is Genesis. Genesis covers basically from beginning creation for around 2,000 years, first 2,000 years. It concludes with the death of Jacob and his sons, the tribes. Okay, that covers that. That's one book of the Torah. The second book of the Torah starts with the Exodus, first of all the bondage and slavery in Egypt, and then the Exodus. But the time they spent in Egypt was 210 years. The Torah only dedicates to it 2.5 chapters. Shmois and Ve'era, middle of Boy. Then begins, when they leave Egypt, is the rest of the Torah. So the rest of the Torah, entire 3 books, and half of Exodus, basically 3 3/4 of the Torah. What is that? 3 3/4 out of 5. That's close to 75%. Yeah, maybe more. Of the Torah is they leave Egypt, and now begins a journey. Where's this journey? In the wilderness. And the rest of the Torah covers only 40 years, which is interesting. One book covers 2,000 years. 2.5 chapters cover 210 years, and the rest is 40 years. The 40 years that they traveled from Egypt to Sinai, and then the 42 steps and journeys they took through the wilderness, the Bamidbar Sinai is called, the wilderness of Sinai wilderness, until the Torah ends literally at the east bank of the river Jordan. So 42 steps for 40 years they traveled. It's interesting disproportion. It only goes to show you that the Torah is not a book of history, because if it was, it's very disproportionate, very non-consistent. Covering one book 2,000 years, another chapter is 210, then 40. The answer is obvious. The Torah is not a history book. That's why it's not meticulous in the details of every year, exactly giving, let's say a chapter per year. What the Torah does is a blueprint for life. It tells us only that which we need to know in life. And the biggest challenge in life is the journey through wilderness, which is why so much of the Torah is preoccupied with that. Just for the record, actually, the last book of the Torah takes place over a period of 1 month and 7 days. Because at the end of the book of Numbers, if you're keeping count, the end of the 4th book, the Jews arrive at the east bank of River Jordan, and the 5th book of Dvarim, what's called Deuteronomy, is entirely dedicated to Moses, the last will and testament, where he reviews everything that happened over the last 40 years and basically leaves the Jews their legacy for the future. But it still all covers in 40 years. So clearly the journey through the wilderness is a critical component, and most of the Torah is preoccupied with that. It's the backdrop. Not good times, they're in a wilderness. And it says clearly in the Torah that this was not a simple wilderness, it was a very hostile one. It's Eretz Yivayif, it was a land of arid land, of course. Nochesh Sarav Akrav, filled with serpents and scorpions and destructive and damaging and dangerous creatures. And obviously, like every wilderness and desert, it's not a human habitat. It's a wilderness. And yet the Jews not only made it through, they became a stronger nation. And they learned how to survive and thrive. So there are many lessons to be learned from this journey, which is what I'd like to address. Why am I addressing it today? Because this week's chapter begins, the 4th book of the Torah starts this week. Bamidbar. So after, as I said, Genesis, which we discussed, then the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus, now comes and it says God spoke to Moses Bamidbar Sinai, in the Sinai desert or the Sinai wilderness. And this book will continue with all the journeys that they took through this wilderness. So there are many, many lessons to be learned of what do we do in a world that is a hostile world. So let's begin with study and contrast would be to compare approaches. You'll have a chapter later in this book that will talk about the scouts that Moses sends to check out Israel, to see before they conquer the land, before they enter the land, to check it out. Now, as you may know the story, the scouts come back with a terrible report saying it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. We can't enter. So their attitude was, we have to stay away from this difficult land. Where do they want to stay? In the wilderness. Which begs the question, why is a wilderness better than going into a land, a land of a civilized land? The answer was because the civilized land for them was a challenge that when you have to get immersed and involved in the material world, it's better to stay in a wilderness where you're not in civilization, you don't have to deal with other people. And they were protected, as we know, by the clouds of glory, and they were given lechem min hashamayim, bread from heaven, man, and water was miraculous water as well. So they wanted to stay in this spiritual type of environment. But clearly it wasn't the wilderness they wanted to stay. They wanted to stay in the oasis within this wilderness. So the question is, when you see difficulties in life, when you see complicated, let's put it this way, corrupt people, what is the approach? How do you deal with it? Let's say you're working in an office and you have corrupt co-workers. And do you ignore it? What happens if demands are made on you? You know, that if you don't do so and so, you won't get a raise, or you may even get fired. What do we do when we're dealing with these type of situations? It's very difficult to just assume a type of insulated posture and be separate from all these challenges, because very simple, we're constantly engaging with others, we're dependent on others, and we're dependent on certain environments. Is it really possible to maintain the highest levels of integrity in the marketplace? And some would argue it's not, because it's a wilderness. It's a difficult place. So you have, for example, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were all shepherds. Why were they shepherds? So the reason that's given is a very simple reason. Because dealing with sheep are docile creatures, more or less. They're not aggressive. They may have their certain aggressions, but they're domesticated, they're easy to control. And they can graze in the fields, in the meadows, without much trouble. So the patriarchs were able to meditate and pray and spiritually connect. Instead of going into so-called Wall Street, into the marketplace, they were able to just so-called insulate themselves. It's a type of asceticism to some extent. That's why they chose to be shepherds. Who was the first one in the Torah that's not a shepherd? Joseph. Against his will, he was also a shepherd in the beginning, like his brothers. But against his will, he's thrown into slavery. He's first almost killed, and then sold into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. He becomes, first of all, an accountant, the first Jewish accountant of Potiphar, who was a minister in Egypt, Egyptian minister. And then he becomes the viceroy of Egypt. When is that? When he interprets the dreams and turns Egypt into a superpower, where grain was the most precious commodity, and during the famine, Egypt became such a power. So he was the first one thrown into so-called the business world. What happened with him? So it says that even though 22 years he was separated from his father, separated from any type of spiritual environment, was in a very corrupt world, corrupt country, Erves Haaretz, it's called the perverse country of Egypt. Nevertheless, he sustained and maintained his integrity. We see that at the end of the story, when Jacob meets him, he recognizes that he never forgot, he never lost his connection to God and to his studies and so on. So which is a greater achievement? To be a shepherd that's separate from the world and maintain your integrity, or to enter a difficult, complex, and corrupt world and maintain your integrity? The answer is obvious. I've mentioned this a number of times. There's a book, a sefer, a holy book from the Middle Ages called Seder Hayom. So he explains a strange Talmud. The Talmud says that we have 3 prayers during the day: the morning prayer, the afternoon prayer, and the evening prayer. And the Talmud says that a person should always be careful with the afternoon prayer, because when was Eliyahu answered? When was Elijah the prophet answered? During the afternoon prayer. So the obvious question is, the morning prayer is a far longer prayer. You say the Shema. The evening prayer, you also say the Shema, which is a fundamental statement. The afternoon prayer seems to be, among the three, the weakest one, so to speak. Can't call it weakest, but the smallest prayer, least significant one. So why is it so powerful? So he answers a very great answer. He answers is because the morning and evening prayers are before the work day and after the work day. So fine, before you go to work or after you finish work, you pray. But to tear yourself away from the middle of the day, while you're at the workplace, while you're competing, while you're busy with negotiating, whatever it is that you're doing, and remember there's a God and pray, that has qualitative a certain power that the other two don't have. So what does this tell us? A basic statement, especially discussed in Hasidic thought, that God desired that the soul come down to this earth to transform a hostile world into a garden. That's the purpose and mission of life. Not just to protect ourselves. I'll take questions of that. To come down into this, which changes the whole perspective on when we see challenges in our lives. We see challenges, some of us retreat or try to avoid them. Some, as I mentioned, insulate themselves. Others just ignore it and move forward if they could do that. Others go to war against it. And most of us succumb in some way. The Jewish approach, which is really a universal approach, is that challenges in life and living in a corrupt world was exactly the way it was meant to be. Not that anyone's justified personally to make a corrupt choice, but it's a world that's hostile. It is hostile. Why? Because self-interest dictates ultimately a certain element of I versus you, us versus them. That's the whole meaning of it. When you read economic theory, and by no means am I advocating Marxism, but you read Karl Marx's scathing attack on capitalism. Adam Smith is the great pioneers of capitalism. So the arguments he makes are very compelling. The only problem was that Marx didn't have a viable alternative. His alternative was worse. As Churchill said, that democracy is the worst system he had ever seen, but he's never found a better one. So capitalism is by no means perfect. There's plenty of problems. But Marxism, or its cousin communism, or another form of socialism, and all its variations, was not a viable option. But his arguments against capitalism are very profound and very real. The argument is that capitalism basically rewards greed, or capitalism is driven on the concept of competition and on private property. So each of us is driven by self-interest. So I'm driven to make as much money as I can. By definition, as Marx writes, that creates an alienation between me and everyone else, because I'm competing over resources. We're competing over resources. It creates an alienation between worker and boss, between the proletariat, as he puts it, and the bourgeois. It makes alienation between workers and the product they create. Because we don't have no more. We don't look at it's not an agricultural system, an agrarian system where you work on a farm and you see direct benefit of your labor. Today, most people, workers, don't even see benefit of their labor. It's something they manufacture in an industrialized way, and it's shipped off somewhere. Someone else benefits. Basically, his argument that there's alienation from your soul. He uses that word actually. So he was hardly spiritual, and definitely not religious. But basically, there's a split. What happens when you go to work and work becomes the center of your life and money becomes the most important thing, we become alienated from ourselves. So you could make a strong argument that this world is driven by self-interest. There's benefits to it because when we have self-interest, it'll motivate us to work hard, to produce, and to excel. But self-interest also has the side effect of how do we interact with others. So if there's no rules and no checks and balances, as many argue that in 2008 exposed the weaknesses of the system where the security system, the SEC, right, that was supposed to be the monitoring and protecting, the watchdog over the security, over the financial system, fell apart. So what happens then when greed and self-interest is the driving force? And for every corporation that has been exposed in the last few years, how many have not been caught or know how to cover their bases? So the argument can be made that the whole economic system is built on a very, very thin ice that is very fragile, and based on trust that not necessarily merits trust. So you can make a strong argument, as many are making, that capitalism is now it's coming to its end because it cannot survive. There's different arguments on the topic. But regardless, the point I'm making here is, however you understand it, is that we do live in a hostile world that is driven by self-interest. But the interesting thing is that Judaism says that's exactly what God created. To speak a more Kabbalistic terminology, you may be familiar that it's called the Lurianic secret of Tzimtzum, doctrine of Tzimtzum. So it goes like this, that the way the Isaac Luria, the great Kabbalist of Tzfas, the 15th century, 16th century I should say, so he teaches in the book called Eitz Chaim and his other books that he didn't write, his student Reb Chaim Vital wrote, the concept that how God, the cosmic process of how God created the universe. Being that God's reality, God's consciousness, divine consciousness is all-consuming, so how is it possible for us to exist with our own independent consciousness, each of us here right now? And you can't say it's an illusion, because it's part of the Torah says God created the world, created human beings, so our sense of individuality is very real. How is it possible? It would be like if we're all submerged in a higher state of consciousness, how can we develop our own independent and individual sense of self? So one of the answer, the doctrine of Tzimtzum comes to answer this and many other questions that are similar. And that is that God in some way concealed his revealed consciousness. So the words of the Arizal says that in the beginning, when I say beginning here, it doesn't mean in time, it's conceptual time, theoretical time, that in the beginning everything was filled by divine consciousness, what he calls a divine infinite light, Ur Ein Sof, Mamala Kol HaMetzias. And then Tzimtzum, he diminished, he concentrated, he contracted, he concealed the divine energy, leaving, as he calls it, a black hole, like a big space, a vacuum, in which he then radiated a very narrow, thin line called the Kav, a Chut, a transmission of energy that would create existence as we know it. But now, because that dominant divine consciousness, light, energy, has been concealed, a independent consciousness, which is ours, can emerge. That's simplifying a very complex concept. The example given for this by Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Baal HaTanya, the founder of Chabad Chassidus, is the classic example of a teacher and a student. Imagine a teacher is infinitely wiser and brighter than his students. If the teacher would just allow his intelligence to flow without filters and checks and veils and so on, what would happen? It would overwhelm the students. So the teacher has to, number one, create a tzimtzum. He has to concentrate and conceal all his intelligence that he has. Then, that's not enough because that's concealment. Then comes a thin stream of consciousness, which we'll call like spoon feeding, where step by step you teach a child first A, B, C, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, and so on. And slowly, as the containers of the child expand and mature, you're able to give more and more light and energy, knowledge to the student. So this is the example. Had you overwhelmed the student or the child with all the information, they get not just confused, they can get completely shattered as a result. So the process and the purpose of existence for us to be able to be independent entities requires, paradoxically, a concealment which also has great risk. Because what happens, as has happened, where we convince ourselves, okay, we're independent entities, and we forget that we come from a greater place. We forget the purpose of our existence. Well, that's exactly what happens upon birth. The Talmud says that our mother's womb, each of us is taught the entire Torah. So we have that consciousness. Then it's all concealed. It's all we're made to forget. Only on a conscious level. Unconsciously it remains. And then we emerge in this world. We grow into adults. And each of us thinks we're self-contained individuals. Which explains a fundamental question that the Kabbalists, the mystics have. Since all human beings are all part of one integral unit, like the Talmud Yerushalmi says, limbs of one body, so how is it possible that one person can hurt another person? It's as inconceivable as the right hand hurting your left hand. The answer is because we don't know we're one body. Because of the tzimtzum, it conceals the unity that connects us all. Even in physics today, you don't need religion for this today. In physics, in neuroscience, and so on, they talk about the right brain and the left brain as the right brain being a field of energy. Everything is part of one field of energy. It's the left brain that sees the distinctions between one detail and another. I mentioned the TED Talk that later became a book called A Stroke of Genius by, what's her name? She's a neuroscientist, and she talks about this, and not in any religious context. But the mystics have always talked about this field of energy. We don't see it. So we're able to hurt each other because we don't see it. So all the injustice in this world, all the pain, all the hostility that I'm describing is based on an invisible, based on a blindness that we do not see the unity that connects us all. Hashem Echad in the Shema is the mission, to reintroduce unity in a world that seems fragmented. But not just fragmented, at this point it's become also divisive. And wars have been fought, and battles, and blood is shed in the competition that people have, whether it's between races and religions, or between individuals, or between families, or communities. So essentially, the world in which we live is paradoxically, ironically, a combination of both a wilderness and a garden. It's a wilderness on the ostensible level because of what I just described. The concealment creates a rat race and competition to the point that people not just are competing, can actually be hurting each other. And they are hurting each other. People actually hurt each other. I'm sure you've heard of this concept, right? Hopefully nobody here has ever been hurt. And yet we say that Adam and Eve were placed in the Garden of Eden as a garden. It was a garden, not a wilderness. Right? Gan Eden, Garden of Eden, paradise. And then due to their sins, they were banished from there, expelled. Where? And to go to the wilderness. But the goal is to return and turn the wilderness into a garden. So the Jews, as they leave Egypt, enter a wilderness. They don't just end up in the promised land. For 40 years they will travel through this wilderness with all kinds of trials and tribulations. It's a dry, as I said, Midbar, a difficult and challenging desert, as Moses says, filled with Nochas, Sarv, Akrav, as I mentioned, destructive forces. Because why is this the predominant element of the Torah? Is because this is the predominant element of our lives. Most of our lives, we live in a presumable and at least ostensible on an external level, a wilderness. But it's not meant to frighten us, it's meant to challenge us and meant to bring out the best within us. So it's an interesting concept. In Hebrew, the word midbar, right? Midbar means wilderness. It also comes from the word medaber. Midbar is wilderness. It also means medaber, one who speaks. Now, as I mentioned, the Alter Rebbe, Shneur Zalman, says in the book called Likutei Torah, on this chapter, he says, there's a verse in the Cheskel that describes the negativity of a wilderness, that midbar shalai yashav adam sham. A midbar, a wilderness, is a place that is an uncivilized place where no man lives. It's not a place that's conducive to be a human habitat. It's harsh, hot, and it's very difficult. Even nomads that live in the wilderness or in the deserts find it very difficult, and they have to adjust all kinds of things. It's not a natural, easy place to live. So he explains, when you say lo yoshav adam sham, which literally means seemingly a negative thing, lo yoshav, no man lives there. He then interprets it from a Kabbalistic, or say a mystical and a psychological perspective. So lo yoshav adam sham, that it's higher than the structure of Adam. It means it refers to a dimension that's higher than structure. So civilized land is structure. The negative wilderness is lower than structure. And the positive wilderness, he says, is higher than structure. Let me explain. Let me explain what that means. Leonard Cohen sings that, forget your perfect offering. The cracks in life are what lets light get in. We may live comfortably in this world and be blessed with comfort. That doesn't necessarily mean our life is great, it just means that we're comfortable. Then when, God forbid, a crisis happens, a trauma, crisis trauma. So it can do two things. It can destroy you, break you, or it can cause you to dig deeper and access new resources. Why can't you access these resources in regular times? Because you're comfortable. When you're comfortable, you're not challenged. The Talmud puts it this way: a zayis, an olive, does not produce oil until you press it. Or, I don't know who was it said, Eleanor Roosevelt or whoever said that women are like tea bags. You don't know how strong they are until you put them into hot water. Is that true? What about men? So men, they put them in hot water, they yell, it's hot, right? So, what's my point? My point is that the structure of what we call Adam, the structure of a human being, is a stable structure, and it's a civilized place. But it doesn't reach that which is beyond structure. And remember, when it comes to transcendence, transcending our lives, finding deeper truths, it's always beyond our structures. So it has something in common with being below structure, has something in common with being beyond structure. Because as long as you're in your civilized comfort zone, you will only have that which you have. Sometimes when something's taken away from you, it can lead you to a place that makes you greater than you've ever been. So it's like going into a wilderness that is a negative wilderness forces you to access a positive type of wilderness which is beyond structure. I'll give a few examples. Let's take an example. You find this. I'm not trying to suggest that destruction brings greater results. I'm trying to suggest that lack of structure can bring something that you'll never get through structure itself. If the Jews had gone straight from Egypt to the Promised Land, what you would have had was they'd settled in the Promised Land, but they would never have gone through. I mean, they did go through the bondage in Egypt. That was hard enough. But on their own, they would never have gone through this challenge of dealing on their own with a harsh world around them. And they would be thrust into a world that may be a very beautiful Promised Land, but they would be, in a way, would not have mature tools to deal with challenges. The wilderness provided them an opportunity, before they entered the Promised Land, to go through a situation that's going to challenge them and force them to dig deeper. So, you have people, for example, we know music and art. Music is a tool that helps us transcend our structures. We live in our monotonous little life that can be a routine, a pattern. And then, at times, we need something to relieve ourselves, some relief from the existential traps, or the existential trappings and existential loneliness of this world. So one of the ways we do it is music. Music takes you to beyond the structure. Now, sometimes you find that some of the greatest musicians produce their best music when they're in pain. Why is that the case? Because as long as you're comfortable in your structure, you never really can reach outside of it. Einstein said that you cannot solve a problem from within a system, because within the system, every solution is coming from that same system. You want to change something, you have to look from outside. So sometimes you need to descend to a place that strips you of your structure in order to reach a place that's beyond your structure. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. It's a very profound statement, and it actually is something we all go through in our lives. In Hasidic or terminology, it's an expression of yesh, ayin, and yesh. That to go from one state of being to grow is always on time. A promise is a promise. It's like perfect reliability, total reliability. But on the other hand, you never see any type of spontaneity, no adventure, no unexpected things. Everything is clockwork. And then there's the other type of guy. A time is not a time, a date is not a date, and you can't always rely on the guy's word. But one thing you can know, it'll always be exciting. It's adventurous. Now, of course, everyone answers, I'd love to have the combination of both of them. But you'll see in personalities don't always work that way. People who are very square, in a sense, and very defined by structure, there's qualities to it, but there's a whole downside to it. Other people are less reliable, but what they have in them is a spark, a type of vivacity that is very, very powerful. Sometimes this is compared to the difference between solar personalities and lunar personalities. The sun is a very reliable source of light. The moon is always going through changes and moods, phases. It waxes, it wanes. So you see that structure has its advantages. But look what happens in every few generations. Look what happened in the 60s, for example. Talk about the rebellion of the youth against what? Against what was called, the expression was the man in the gray flannel suit. Everybody after World War II were building families. They were all wearing gray flannel suits, buying homes in the suburbs. The whole conformity. And a young person who's looking who has energy, gets bored or sick and tired of this monotony, and rebels. Rebellion can lead to all kinds of trouble. You're challenging institutions, breaking laws, challenging authority. But on the other hand, it's introducing a dimension that is beyond structure. You see when they began experimenting, they called sex, drugs, and rock and roll revolution. What was it all about? It was about a rebellion, a revolution against the normal structures. So you can bemoan the fact and say, okay, it was a rebellion that ended up causing more problems than it solved. Maybe. But it's coming from a spirit inside the human being that refuses to conform to the status quo and wants to challenge it in some way. So if it's not harnessed, it could be destructive. There are people that OD'd, in search for the sky. You have all these young geniuses. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison. All these people, what they did was, they're looking to touch something greater than the tangible. And they couldn't handle it. They got burned out as a result. So you can criticize the way they did it, but not what they were searching for. And you find in the Torah as well, you find Nadav and Avihu, the two brothers, sons of Aaron, go into the temple and get burned out, literally get burned up in their ecstasy. The 4 that went into the paradise, into the orchard, 3 came out very damaged as a result. Rabbi Akiva was the only one that went in and was able to exit. So as soon as you're looking to go beyond structure, there's always risks involved. But on the other hand, human beings by nature, we're restless people. Some people maybe can go day by day, exactly the same routine, never have to change anything. But most people are not that way. And if we do become that way, it's usually due to a certain lethargy or maybe conformity. Because look at young children. Children do not follow rules. Children are always moving about. You have to constantly try to control them because they're full of energy. So to go back to this theme here, the wilderness, on one hand, is Lo Yoshev Adam Sam, it's lower than human civilization. On the other hand, it challenges the structures of civilization and forces you to think outside of the box and to reach a place that's beyond structure, beyond civilization. So here we get already deeper. The first thing I said earlier was that God intended a world to be this hostile world, for us to come turn it into a garden. Now it's something deeper. The hostility of this world, well, let's put it this way, this world that has a certain wilderness dimension to it is actually rooted in a place that's beyond structure. Is this way. Souls in Gan Eden, souls in paradise, in heaven, as well as angels and so on, all live in a spiritual habitat. They're very comfortable. They don't have to deal with health issues, with money issues. They don't have to deal with corruption and so on. However, so they remain in a very stable place. When you come to this world, because it's such a cataclysmic paradigm shift, a world that is so antithetical to the divine, a world of a wilderness, Atzilus, the higher spiritual worlds, are not a wilderness. They're full of divine energy, but they're very comfortable. It's like living in a world of peace without challenges. When you come into a world that is a wilderness, what happens now is that the challenges dig deeper and they're rooted in a place that's higher than those so-called sacred environments, which is a radical statement because it's basically saying that turning the wilderness into a garden is greater than what's greater, being in the street or being in a synagogue or in your home. So you think a synagogue is the holiest place to be. The Beis Hamikdash is the holiest place to be, the holy temple. Yes, in holiness it's greater. But in comfort zones, it's not. And the purpose is to go outside of the temple, to go into a world that is not holy, and sanctify it. And when you do that, you reach a place that's beyond. The wilderness reaches a place that's beyond the structure, even of the temple. So you have Shabbos is one day of the week, and 6 days of the week is weekdays. Why? If Shabbos is such a holy day, and is the purpose of all of existence is to sanctify everything like Shabbos, we should have 6 days Shabbos and 1 day work week. 1 day work. In order to fulfill the purpose. No, because the purpose of existence is not Shabbos. The purpose of existence is to transform the material world into a spiritual place. And the material world is the predominant activity we do. And the challenge in this world, where you do see corruption, and you see people who have what's the word I want to say? Not surrendered. More than succumb. Have fallen, have failed. And being able to build up strength to not just resist that, but to transform it, that comes from a place that's higher than all the holy worlds. That comes from a place that's beyond all structures. Now, it's not something we aspire to, but they had this this experiment or exercise. I read about it in a book where someone wrote a book about it. He decided to live like a homeless person for 2 years, or for a year, I'm not sure. And literally, he did it in the full sense of the word. And he writes about what he came to learn from it. Now you can imagine, it's one of the saddest things to see is a homeless person without a home. You wonder where their family is. You wonder how they got here. Someone lying in the street, sleeping, cardboard box. Human beings just like us. Someone that was giving birth to a mother and a father. Where's their mother and father? What happened? So fine, we could explain some things away with certain mental illness and so on. But it's not only that. Like how you wonder what the trajectory, how did someone with dignity choose for the first time to sleep in the street? It didn't happen overnight. Nobody began that way. They began some crib. So good. I'm sure you can find unwanted children. You can find all kinds of other tragic situations. But it's a very, very, we usually ignore it because we throw maybe a few pennies or coins out of empathy or out of Rahman's mercy. But it's interesting, a human being. So he writes basically how he went through this and how much more he appreciated, obviously, having a home and having a life. I met a person like that who was homeless. And it was due to a lot of factors. But this person today has built a life. And in many ways, I envy the person, not the homeless part, but being homeless, being in a Bamidbar, in a wilderness where there was no structure, taught this person a certain refinement and kindness that regular people don't have. So it's not like I wish it upon everyone, but you could see lessons, each of us in our own way. When something breaks down, the thing we hate most is losing something. The thing we hate most is losing our comfort zone. But it's always the thing that brings you to the greatest successes. So we should all have it in a minimal sense, not, God forbid, in a tragic way. But it teaches you that structure is not as important as we think it is. People worship it, worship money, worship structures, and then something happens, they realize it's all meaningless. The money is meaningless. What's money worth if I can't have my family or other important things? Because we can become blinded in this post-Tzimtzum reality where we think this is it, and we convince ourselves that the wilderness is a comfort zone. And that's why you have to become aware that no, the discomfort in this world can be the catalyst that brings you to some of the greatest achievements in your life. But you have to know a few things. Number one is that you were sent here on a mission. Number two, therefore, you have the power, not just to succumb and be overwhelmed by all of this, but to actually transform it. And number three, you have to act on that. And the best defense is offense. You're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. What does that mean? That you're either going to take your tools and skills and resources that God blessed you with and do something to change the environment around you. To sit and moan and sigh and groan. Look how bad the world is. Look how much I've been hurt by it. And why it's not fair. That one deserves, why does that one deserve and I don't deserve? You tell me one good benefit that comes out of that type of, what they call in Yiddish, krechtzig. Nothing. You can take a second approach and become bitter and broken about it all. You can take a third approach and just become very fierce and angry and aggressive. Or you can do something which is the road less traveled, the thing that less people do. Dig deeper and say, why did God put me in this situation? Discover deeper resources and figure out a way to help the world in some way, to help change the world. Now you could say it's counterintuitive. What do you mean? The world has hurt me. Why would I go back and save and help this world? Because it's not your world, it's God's world. And at the end of the day, your soul, no matter what it goes through, remains intact. And just a matter of digging deeper and finding deeper resources. The fact that you've been in the wilderness, yes, there's a wilderness, but there's a place that's beyond the structure too. Access that. That's why there are people who've gone through and been broken in life, have a strength that comes from a place that's beyond the structure that you can't really even explain. Hemingway wrote that life breaks all people and some are stronger in the broken places. Now, he wasn't one of those someones because he then proceeded to commit suicide. So it didn't really work out for him. But the line's still true. Some are stronger in the broken places. Because those some, as Viktor Frankl writes in Man in Search of Meaning in the Logotherapy, he writes that the people who understood that life has meaning, he said, even if they suffer greatly, the meaning never goes away. They may not know the meaning in the suffering, they may not understand, they may not be happy with it. But there's something that's stronger that keeps them going. And that stronger, invisible thing is ultimately a connection to God. Now, it's interesting. That connection to God is now beyond structure because you didn't come to it through the conventional means. Look how many people do we know that get closer to the divine, to God, because of good things? You know, when good things happen to them, they're happy, they're thankful, they're humble. And how many people come closer to the divine and God through suffering? I've never done a study of it, but guaranteed the latter is more. Why? Why is that the case? Doesn't make sense. A person is blessed, let's say, nice family, beautiful family, wealth, I'm giving everything, good education. A person is liked, charismatic. I mean, all the qualities that a person has. Why would they not simply say, thank God, I look at other people around me who don't have that, and I'm humbled by this. Why is that not a common reaction? Because the Tzimtzum HaRishon, as I mentioned before, conceals the divine, and you convince yourself it's me. Yeah, you may thank God because you know that you want to be on his good side, and you never know when he may start to play around. So Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, we make a deal, a new contract. But at the end of the day is, because the good in your life, you convince yourself, what do you mean? It's because I'm a smarter guy, I'm a better guy. So the Torah comes, and the Smag actually says it's a lav, which means it's a Torah, a Isha Daraisa, to say, Keichi ve'etzim yadi, asali sachar lazeh, that my strength and my power achieved these successes, gave me this power, they gave me this achievements. It has to be qualified. Why? Because that's the nature of human beings. Why is that the nature of human beings? Not because essentially we're that way. Because God concealed himself from us. He'll let you be successful and will conceal his hand. It'll be like an invisible hand, which is not maybe so invisible. If you thought about it, you realize it's not so invisible. But you have the choice. There's a very strange Gemara. The Talmud says, when Moses was being taught the Torah by God, coming Shavuos in a few weeks, on Mount Sinai. So he's reading in the beginning of the Torah, Nasa Adam B'Tzalmeinu. God says, let us create the human being in our image and our our image and our shape. So Moshe Rabbeinu immediately says to God, what is this our? People are going to think there's a partnership here. There's more than one God. Why would you write such a thing? And it's a very strange answer God gives. God could have given an answer that, whatever. The answer he gives is, those that want to make a mistake, let them make a mistake. Now, why do that? You could have written, we know Hashem Echad, could have written, not Nasa, you write, Asa, whatever the expression you could say. Why build in a mistake and then say, when Moshe is answering, let them make a mistake? It's the basis, obviously, of free will. But it's deeper than that. It's not that God is trying to trick us by putting in a line, we. Basically revealing that existence itself will have that challenge. We will think there's duality. There's me and there's God. You can be a very so-called devout religious person and also have a partnership with God. I exist and God exists. So God gave me life, fine. He gives me parnasa, livelihood, health, etc., etc. But there's two of us. So that God didn't have to write in the Torah. That would be human nature. Humans would feel that way. I guess the Christians added a third partner. But basically we have this partnership where we think, it's a partnership between us. So God wasn't sticking in a word to confuse. He was writing a word that reflects actually how we think. That there is an us here. How many of us really feel that we're not self-made people? Which is why Jacob, when he said the famous line, "Katainti mikol achsadim," I am humbled. Katainti means literally I've turned small, I'm diminished, but I'm humbled because of all your kindness. One of the classic lines. It's an unbelievable line because it means in goodness and kindness he was humbled. As I said, most of us are humbled when things aren't working well, and that's when we run to synagogues far faster because we want help. When things are not going well. I remember I was in Lima, Peru, a number of years ago. It was a conference on happiness. So I was a speaker, and there was another gentleman. He was a psychiatrist. What was his name? He was Jewish, but he was a secular psychiatrist. Come to me. I wrote about it in some articles. And he presented from a so-called psychological perspective. I presented from a Torah, Hasidic perspective. But I remember something he said that remained with me. He says studies show that that when you, let's say, gain you win $1,000, so you obviously have some happiness. If you lose $1,000, you have some sadness. Is the sadness as much as your happiness? In other words, does gaining 1,000 get rid of the sadness of 1,000? No, of losing, no. You need to make 3,000 to counter the pain of losing 1,000. Those studies. You can use other examples, but that's one of them. So his suggestion was, so for every negative thought you have, you should have 3 positive thoughts. Because the negative thoughts will always be more powerful. I don't know if the number's exactly right. His study, I'm fine with the studies, even though Jews, if we followed studies, we wouldn't be here. Statistics and numbers and predictions. But fine, studies have their value. And it's interesting. So my understanding, after he spoke, I speculated that maybe the reason is because there's a thing called entitlement. We're born with entitlement. So you think you deserve 1,000. So yes, you get satisfaction that it was confirmed. But when you lose, you're far more disturbed because, what do you mean? Why taken away from me? You're far more shocked by it, so to speak. Which is essentially what Eov, was told by God, when Job says to God, the entire book is about his dialogue with God and all the problems and the archetype of suffering is Job. So there's one line there when God responds to him. This line always, touches me very deeply. It seems to capture it all. God says to him, I'm paraphrasing a bit, he says to him, you ask me about all these questions about loss and death and suffering and why you suffer, good people suffer. But were you there when I created it all, that you can ask me this question? So I'm just giving my take on that. God is basically saying, you ask me why there's death, but do you ask me why there's birth? You ask me why there's suffering, but do you ask me why there's joy? You ask me why there's the end, but did you ask me why there's the beginning? Because remember, if there was no beginning, there'd be no end. If there was no birth, there'd be no death. If there's no joy, there'd be no suffering. If there was no existence, there wouldn't be any of this. But no one asked that question. Yes, we ask it philosophically. Of course, we all wonder why things are here. But what really bothers us when we're suffering? Why am I hurt? And I'm not even saying it's a bad question. You see a child, an innocent child, suffering. You have to be inhumane not to feel compassion and feel even being really upset. Why would an innocent child have to suffer? And it makes your blood boil when you see what was done to the Jews, for example, during the Holocaust. I'm not dismissing any of that. I'm not saying it shouldn't bother us. But it's an interesting take on human nature. We will be bothered far more when things don't work than we'll be happy when things do work. Because it's a given for us that we exist. And again, I'm not talking about someone who's, due to abuse or other reasons, has a sense of no entitlement and feels that they don't deserve anything, that we have that too. But more or less, a normal, healthy person growing up in a decent home where they was nurtured has a sense that I deserve. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. It's bad when you become consumed with it and you realize, and you become selfish and self-contained and the whole narcissism that comes with it. But even in halacha, there's halacha laws that say chayecha koidmen, which means when you have, let's say, a bottle of water and you're in a place where there's no water, who do you give the water to, yourself or someone else? So there are exceptions, but you have to first take care of your life. Not because you're selfish, because the Torah says God gave you your life to protect. You have to take care of your life. So actually, the selfless person who may want to give it away to someone else, the Torah will say no. Chai b'hem, chayecha koidmen, and so on. My point that I'm making is that we live in a world that the self is very dominant. And that's why when good things happen, that's why we sometimes need a wilderness where we're lost. We're lost in the wilderness. And actually feeling lost can be the biggest blessing in your life. I know that sounds a little weird, so I don't want to bless you that you should feel lost. That's not exactly. I want to bless you should feel aware that you're lost. Because Yediyas hamach lechetzi refuah, knowing the problem is have the cure. So feeling lost, feeling desperate even. And I know I say that word very carefully because I know the word desperate is not exactly a word that elicits all kinds of smiles and good feelings inside. But there's healthy desperation, there's unhealthy desperation. Unhealthy desperation is the one that leads to a lot of demoralization and the negative sort. I'm not talking about that. What's healthy desperation? Where you're not neutral. You're not complacent. You're really desperate for that thing. You really want it. And not, again, selfishly. You want it because it's important. Young people in America today, young, older, remember the older were once younger, so everybody really comes into this field. You ask people, young men and women, and I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot here. You could ask yourself in your own privacy, are you ready? Is there anything in your life you're ready to die for? Excuse me. And I don't mean die literally, because thank God we don't have to die for our faith or for other things. But something that's so important that you would be ready to give everything away for it. Most people look at you when you say this question, they don't know what you're talking about. Why would I have to do that? Why can't I have it without dying for it? Is a general response. And why? Because of the comforts of our times. When you're comfortable, you tend to lose crystallization of a vision. Why should you have a vision? Everything is comfortable. There's always tomorrow. I'm not running for my life. When you're not comfortable, that's when you focus. It's sad to say this, but the most efficient machine on earth is, you know what? War. They say it's the father of all invention. Some of the most dramatic inventions of our lives today were developed in war times. You may not know this, but the internet is a war creation. Just to give you one example. Even belts, they wear suspenders. Belts are the World War I. It was a cheaper way to create uniforms. Because when there's war, there are stakes. You have an enemy there who wants to kill you and wants to take your land and take your family and take everything. And either you win or he wins. That crystallizes very much of value. What are you fighting for? Am I ready to fight? And men and women would go and bear arms to go fight because they're fighting for something. Now, God forbid, I don't even want to suggest that we need a war or we need an enemy. We need the same amount of passion without an enemy. That's the challenge. How do you generate such energy when you don't have an enemy? So I studied this a lot because I was always looking for passion, And in this world, as I said, yes, you could have passion. There are people who are passionate Red Sox fans and Yankee fans, and there's passion in certain video games and watching certain sitcoms and series. There's a lot of passion everywhere. But I think I don't have to explain that those passions are are being channeled to things that are quite temporary, to say the least. So I observed my own Rebbe, teacher, mentor, you can call him, the Rebbe Lubavitcher Rebbe, a man of unbelievable passion and energy, which drew me. And I saw he declared war on what? There was no Nazis to declare war. The war was over in World War II. No communists to a certain extent, but the enemies that we once had became less and less defined outside enemies. So he declared war on apathy, on complacency, on comfort zones. That was the war he declared. Trying to generate the same amount of passion in good times as do we have in bad times when we're fighting the enemy. That's what's required. So it comes down to being desperate. Yes, I met a guy 3 weeks ago, very good person. And I said, and he had a lot of issues and so on. So I said, do you have a mission in your life? Something you're ready completely to? He says, no. Why do I need a mission? I couldn't explain to him why he needs a mission. He has 1,000 problems. If he had a mission, he wouldn't have any of those problems. But I couldn't explain it to him because he didn't see a reason. So I said, until you're desperate to know why your soul came down to this earth, why God of all people chose you to put you in this earth with your talents and your opportunities, I said to him, you're going to be a ship that's lost at sea. And if God protects you, you may make it through. But if God doesn't protect you, you're completely vulnerable to all the winds and forces which are overwhelming you as it is. So yes, there are band-aid solutions, short-term remedial solutions. But if you want the biggest solution, find your purpose in life. It seems like such an obvious statement to me. Every business can't function without a mission statement. How can we? But we do. Because we figure out ways to maneuver in the comforts of our lives. And money is a big, big force that replaces higher mission. And then there's power. And then there's sexuality. And then there's all kinds of other things that make us feel good. Pleasures. That keep you busy. And a person like that, yes, until God forbid a crisis comes, probably cannot wake them up from their reverie and complacency. So a wilderness, being aware you're in a wilderness, causes passion. There's a wilderness here. I'm struggling for my survival. We know the example, Rabbi Akiva's example, why Jews are so dedicated, committed to Torah. Every 3 days, at least once every 3 days, we read from the Torah. Why? Because Ein Mayim Ela Torah. Torah is compared to water. And just like a person can't survive without water for 3 days, you can't survive without Torah. So Moses designated, we read the Torah on Mondays, Thursdays, of course on Shabbos. So the example, why can't you separate? So you give the example of the fish in the sea. The fox came to the edge of the water and cried out to the fish, why don't you come out here a little, change of venue. Hang around the ocean, the water all your lives. And the fish say, we thought you were such a wise creature, the fox. Don't you realize if we come out of the water, yes, it may be nice entertainment, but we're not going to last too long. We are part of the water. The water is our sustenance. So Kashem, just like fish can't be separated from water, a Jew can't be separated from Torah. So you could say, in difficult times, that makes sense. When the Romans were decreeing and persecuting us, the Babylonians earlier, the Persians in between, the Romans later, throughout history. So yes, what was our survival? We had to hold on for our dear lives to Eitz Chaim Hila Machzikim Ba, to hold on to this tree of life, because we had nothing else to hold on to. Because no one else was protecting us. So we needed very strong spiritual underpinnings to keep us. But today, someone say, 1 second, we're fine. It's a country that is pretty peaceful, a haven for Jewish life. I can find kosher sushi, Chinese, Japanese, Thai, Asian, whatever. You know the list? Every type of food, it's kosher, hashgachas, etc., etc. So I'm not desperate. so I'm a fish, so I'll go out of the water for a while. There's no desperation. And the greatest irony of all ironies, which I don't even know why is not mentioned so often, is that 500 years ago, when there was all types of persecution, and there wasn't a Jew on earth that was safe, 99.9% of Jews were observant. And today, where we are safe almost anywhere, the numbers are not quite as much the other way around, but pretty much the whole thing has changed. The answer is because complacency and apathy and comfort zones are more dangerous than enemies. So not that we have to turn the clock back, we have to reignite a passion that's equal to that passion. That's the challenge. It's a big challenge because it's far easier. Ask the charities, the charity world. I was invited around 7 years ago to speak in Florida. They had UJA's Young Leadership. Well, that basically is a code word for cultivating the young generation to give money when the older ones are already moving on. So you need to constantly. It's called Young Leadership. You'll see it everywhere. I don't know if I revealed a trade secret here or something, but that's the story. So the question they asked me was to speak about how to inspire the next generation to give. It was a good question because they were not interested in giving. And the reason is very obvious. You're probably all aware of this. The greatest monies given by Jews is when there's crisis. The whole UJA and the joint and all that was born in the beginning of the 20th century. Why? Because of the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. So the American Jews felt we have to help them. That was the reason. They're being killed. What are you doing? Are you helping them or not? How much money was poured into Israel in 1948? Because a fledgling state that barely could make it. But now, once you have all this and everybody's comfortable, and there's no visible enemy, now what? Well, that's why you have an anti-defamation league, you have a Simon Wiesenthal Center, and you have hundreds of other organizations are still anti-Semitism. That's what they stand for. Because the biggest money you make is when you're fighting an enemy. Some are cynical and say there's not so much anti-Semitism as they make it. Some say there is. However, whatever side of the aisle you're on, but there's no question, nothing sells like tragedy. The classic joke where the guy gets up in the Knesset and says, I have the solution to all our problems. Instead of fighting with the Arabs, let's attack America. They'll, of course, beat us, and then out of guilt, they'll rebuild us like they did Japan and Germany after World War II. Great. So an old Jew gets up in the back and says, very nice idea, but what happens if we win? The Jews win, in other words. So, as underdogs and playing defense, nobody is as good as us. We're survivors. But once you have power, so to speak, and so it says, okay, I understand your vision was to create a homeland in a place where we were surrounded by enemies. Kifsa achas, one sheep among 70 wolves. But now we have a homeland. And now we have comforts. What's our vision today? So you tell a young person and say, our vision is to fight racism. Our vision is to fight anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism. But what do you stand for? I know what you don't stand for. I know what you stand against. But what do you stand for? It's a lot harder to answer that question. And especially develop a passion that is as desperate as the desperation of fighting the negative. I don't like to say this, but I say it anyway to young people looking for shidduchim. So I said, are you desperate to find a soulmate? No, I'm not desperate. It's optional. Oh, it's optional. Why would anyone get involved in marriage with all the challenges and all the doubts and risks if it's optional? If you have another option, why choose this option? Okay, I understand the person didn't mean completely optional. But yes, sometimes you need a healthy desperation to get you off your, what shall we call it, butt? To get you off your comfort zone and make a move. So I know the word desperation is strong, but yes, that's ultimately what it comes down to. I know for myself, I excel when I'm desperate. What do I mean desperate? Not desperate that I'm gasping for air, thank God. Desperate that I feel I must do something. Why else would you work hard and achieve something if you don't feel that way? So if you don't like the word desperate, you could change it with another word. I'm just using it to drive the point home. So let's go back to Midbar Sinai. This is what the Baal Tanya says. The Yecheskel, the pasuk says, Midbar ashalei yashav adam sham. A midbar is a barren wilderness where not fit for civilization. So no person lives there. That can be interpreted as a wilderness in a negative sense. But he says it connects to le yashav adam sham, that God is higher than being nasa adam kitsamenu. To say that God created the human being in the divine image, that doesn't make God in the human image. It means that God manifested himself in a way that we reflect that part of his image. But everyone asks the question, is that what defines God? Of course not. There's even a machlekes, there's a disagreement between the Rambam, Maimonides, and the Maral. Maimonides says, Hu yideyu, hu amadev, hu yidua. He is the one that knows, he's the knower, and so on. God is one with the knowledge that he has. And the Maral says, how could you call God a knower? Le machshavese machshavesechem. God is beyond. Lav inun midus hiu klal. He's beyond structure. So Hasidic thought explains that the divine essence is beyond all structure, obviously. Beyond even the structure of logical laws, because God created logic. Which of course explains why you can't prove God's existence, because you're going to prove God's existence with a proof that God created. Proof itself, logic itself. Like you want God to be a product of your mathematical equations. So God is beyond logic, beyond structure, manifested himself in a structure, which is essentially what we say, that God has the names Hashem, Elohim, and so on. And then there's a world that is lower than structure. That's called the wilderness. And sometimes to reach the God that's beyond structure, you need to go to the wilderness that's lower than structure, which is our desperation, our pain, our loss. You need to feel lost. 40 years the Jews traveled through a wilderness, and that hardened them to be able to enter basically the promised land, and still needed plenty of work. So in the final analysis, I would say the following. We each have our challenges in life. Not only should the challenges not be seen as forces that bring us down, these are forces we can overcome and overpower. In addition to the fact, more than that, because that's the purpose of existence, to be sent into a world that appears like a wilderness. But above all, and this is the final thing, is that you can reach a place of greatness specifically because of the challenges of this world. So that requires us to always remain removed and somewhat apart from the corruption we see around us. Not just not to succumb to it, but to realize that's part of the challenge, and that when you see that, that should challenge you to reach deeper and come up with more passion and energy to overcome and transform this world. That's the power we have. And you'll see all great people in history, and even not such great people who achieved something, basically did not buckle and succumb to the conformist attitude, oh, everybody's doing it. They took a path, they stuck to it, it made no difference whether others laughed or mocked or dismissed them, and they did it. Every time you fly in an airplane, think about it. The Wright brothers would come to you 150 years ago and say, you know what? I need an investment from you. How much money? I don't know, whatever. $1,000 was a lot then, so let's say $10. What do you need an investment for? I'm going to create a flying ship. A flying ship that flies in the skies. You tell me which normal person would give them a penny. They throw them out and say you're crazy. Birds fly, humans don't fly. Yeah, whether it's them and others, set their mind to it, and that's it. They're going to figure out how to fly. And they create an airplane. And now you go to airports with all the hassles, taking off your shoes, not taking off your shoes, the whole hassle of flying these days. It's a whole industry, it's a whole city. Every time a plane takes off, I always think about two mushugayim who decide they're going to fly. And everyone must have told them they're nuts. I'm sure their families and so on. Because in the beginning, it didn't like they just flew one day. How many attempts they had to make. But they did it. So there's no such thing as impossible. And that has nothing to do with religion and faith. I see that, frankly, as an element of God in them. It may not be called religious faith. It's faith in something they believe in. And passion and desperate to do it. There's a doctor who comes here once in a while to class. He's a researcher. I think by training he's a cardiologist, but he does research. He determined that he's going to conquer a few illnesses that he found, not the major ones. In his lifetime, he wants to eradicate those illnesses. So he does research all day and all night. He's working, he's completely committed to it. Now he calls himself a self-proclaimed atheist. Now you ask, why does he come to this class? He says he's an atheist, but he likes my classes. That's it. He says, your God I could handle, I think. So I said to him once, I said, how do you know you're going to find a cure to these illnesses? What happens if you discover in 20, 30, 40 years from now that you put all this energy, money, time, and you didn't? It's an impact. I will find a cure. So I said, you're a fanatic. You're called a religious fanatic. You're the biggest believer I know. Because you're ready to spend your rest of your life finding a cure because you're convinced everything can be healed. How do you know? Maybe there's some things can be healed. So he doesn't want to use it God. He'll call it nature, the power of nature, the power of regeneration, the power of healing, whatever. So that fanatic is short for fan. But you never hear anyone say sports fanatics and religious fans. Because, for obvious reasons. The point I want to make is that the wilderness challenge us is the cracks, as I said from Leonard Cohen, the cracks that let deeper light emerge. In Hasidic terminology, or taken from a pasuk in Kehelas, where Shlomo Melech, King Solomon, writes, "V're'isi ani, I've seen, sheyes yisun hachachma min hasichlos, ki yisun er min hacheshach." I've seen that there's an advantage, a superiority of wisdom over folly, over foolishness, like light over darkness. So Yisun Er Min HaCheshach can mean light over darkness, or Yisun Er Min HaCheshach, that from darkness, from a wilderness that's lower than civilization, you can find the power of light that you can never find in regular daylight. The eclipse of the sun sometimes reveals to us, not sometimes, always, dimensions of the sun that you cannot see in regular sunlight. Put someone in hot water, challenge them, and you'll see strengths that you do not see in conventional moments. So we enter this fourth book of the Torah called Bamidbar Sinai. The whole book is called Bamidbar. In the Latin and the English version, it's called Numbers. Because there's another name for this book, it's called Sefer HaPkudim, Book of Numbers, the book of counting, census. Because there's a census of the Jewish people in this chapter, and later in Parashat Pinchas, the second census. It says there are 10 censuses that the Jews were counted 10 times in history. The last will be when Mashiach comes, but 2 of them are in this book. So Numbers is the reason it's called Numbers, if you're wondering. But the so-called, the more I would say original, not Sefer Pekudim, but Sefer Bamidbar. Why would a whole Sefer in Torah be called a Sefer of wilderness? Okay, so you could say Sefer Bamidbar Sinai, fine, Sinai redeems it a bit. But still, Bamidbar Sinai, the wilderness. You say Bamidbar, Sefer Bamidbar. And it begins, V'adaber Hashem al Moshe, he could have said, Ba'ayel Ma'id, we know that they're traveling in the wilderness, Bamidbar Sinai. And many times, Bamidbar Sinai. Bamidbar Sinai. And 42 journeys that will be going through this Midbar. In this book itself, at the end of the book of Bamidbar, will conclude Maseh. These are the journeys that they traveled through the desert from when they left Egypt until they came to the east bank of the river Jordan. And the answer is because the Torah is a reflection and a blueprint for life. Our lives are in a wilderness. We live in a world that's a wilderness. So the Torah wants to make it very clear. There's a sefer called Bamidbar, and it talks about a journey. As I said before, 80% of the Torah occupies itself with the 40 years in the wilderness. Chumash Bereshis, Genesis, is the 2,000 years from Adam till the end of Yaakov and the Shvatim's lives. 2.5 chapters in Exodus, as I mentioned, Shmois Va'erab, half of Boy, is about the 210 years in Egypt, slavery. And then, from there, from the middle of Boy, when they leave Egypt, till the end of Bracha, is all about the 40 years in the wilderness. With the last book being Moshe repeating it the last month of his life. But 40 years, pretty interesting. That so much of the Torah is all about 40 years in the wilderness. The Baal Shem Tov says that the 42 Mambeis Masas that we go through, that the Torah that we went through then in Egypt, in the wilderness rather, is 42 journeys that we each go through in our lifetimes. And some places it says every day we go through 42. I actually wrote up a whole series of articles on the 42 journeys in our lifetimes. 42 in a day I couldn't figure out yet. Doesn't say what they are. But it'll be interesting to study itself. Because that's the challenge. We come into a world that no longer looks like Gan Eden. It's not paradise. We were banished from paradise. It looks more like a jungle. There was a Rosh Yeshiva tells me he's a headmaster of a school. So I said, what did you accomplish in the school? He said, I turned the jungle into a zoo. There's the students. You have to know Yeshiva Bochum to understand that joke, right? A jungle into a zoo. So we live in a world that's pretty much like a jungle. It doesn't look like a jungle exactly, but how people behave. And our goal is to turn the wilderness into a garden. So what better example is to look at what happened when the Jews went through the wilderness, how they were challenged. And now obviously they had three forms of protection, the clouds, the water, and the bread from heaven. So for us, we may not have that in such a visible way, but we also have protection. We sit in sukkahs for that reason. One of the reasons, because it's like the clouds. And when you understand parnasa, so one of the Rebbes says, Reb Marash, that parnasa b'zman hazeh is like man, like lechem min hashamayim. If a person really looks closely, why some people are matzliach, success in parnasa, they'll see it's min hashamayim. That's not due only to effort. That business people can see Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence, more than Talmidei Chacham, tzaddikim sitting in a yeshiva. And we have, of course, water. The water is Torah, however you want to define it. But we definitely are not in the protection that we had then. So we discover from the wilderness how to reach deeper strengths. I want to bless everybody that in this, as we open this chapter, which leads us next chapter, and then to actually receiving the Torah at Sinai, at Shavuos, to be able to glean strength, not just from the beautiful passages about the Garden of Eden, but also the beauty that lies even in deserts. And I don't know if you ever took a tour in some of these deserts where you could see an unbelievable resources of life in the strangest places. How cacti have water in them and how creatures survive in the desert. So it has its own mysterious resilience. Still not a place for a human being to live, or very difficult for us to live. But we have learned to irrigate deserts. We've learned to transform them. So in a spiritual sense, the challenges of our wilderness, being lost, can be turned, even feeling lost, can be turned into an unbelievable catalyst of a passionate spiritual revolution. So I bid you all, fellow revolutionaries, to use your strengths, to do whatever it takes to not be on the defense but on the offense. Use your faculties, your skills to make a difference. When you go to work tomorrow, when you meet people, be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Do something proactive. Say something. Initiate something. That's how things change. And to sit back and say, who am I? A nova shel sheker, meaning false humility, or other things, is not the Jewish way. We can make things happen. So we should all be blessed to have that courage and hang around other people that make things happen. That usually is contagious. And everyone should have a beautiful week. And Philip will be giving his class tomorrow night. We'll be here next Wednesday night. The following Wednesday after that, I believe, is Shavuos already, right? 2 weeks? Yeah. Correct? Yes. Okay, so everyone have a very pleasant week. Great. Thank you so much.